Sanjeen Kumar. I'm 59 and born in London. Father came in 1959 to become a dentist. Mother joined a few years later as he went back after he had settled down and for an arranged marriage and met my mum and brought her back. I think my grandfather pushed my father to leave the village, but also purely in terms of opportunities and a chance to make a sort of a better life. So I started in London, and then after a couple of years, parents decided rather than raise myself and two younger brothers in a sort of an Indian enclave, we would move to somewhere proper, sort of home counties, where we were the only Indian faces probably for several miles around. In terms of school, only brown face out of several hundred boys at the school I was at. In terms of what it was like, there's always that aspect of being different, and so you try and sort of join in, but physically you do look different. So you develop sort of approaches in terms of sort of humour, things like that, in terms of how you deal with challenges. Well, humour predominantly, and if that didn't work, occasionally you would have to stand up for yourself. I mean, this was the 70s, and it was. The UK is not what it is now. England is not what it is now. And in terms of, if you think of some of the comedies of the time, or even the, sort of stereotypes, sort of coming out of a colonial period, it could be quite tough. Whereas today, the most popular dish is it chicken tikka masala? At the time, it was probably a prawn cocktail. So, a very different environment to grow up in. So, the home environment was supportive, and I think again the values that they brought were around, for example, education, and the importance of education was always stressed. Also, the to think about how you could serve in a community, and it wasn't just your home, but you had to be also present and sort of do what you could in terms of helping out in your local community. Also in terms of other things, so parents, part of assimilating by having moved to where we did in just north of London, there was also an aspect of quite a normal upbringing, so joining the Scouts, sort of youth groups and that type of thing. But again, you always that sense of slightly being an outsider, but it was happy, it was good. Yeah, I think. At the time, actually, they were probably quite liberal. As they got older, I think they become more, you should be more like this. But it was liberal in as much as I have two brothers. We all went to completely different schools that suited our personalities, as opposed to, all just going to the same ones. I think the sort of home life, just coming back to your question, in terms of food, for example, we ate Indian food, but to be honest, we lived right next to a Waitrose, and every day when Dad finished his dentistry, he'd come home and disappear for an hour, and then the joke was he'd gone to the temple for an hour, and he would come back with whatever was on offer. So we ended up eating world food, in as much as Waitrose defined world food in the 70s and 80s. So my father was a dentist, NHS dentist, and very respected in the community. Later, as a lot of dentists went private, he absolutely believed in the ethos and the values of the NHS and refused to shift. I mean, he could have financially done a lot better, but he just said no. He really believed in that sort of social value that the NHS offers. So when I was 18, I went off to university in Hull, so up north. Freedom for the first time. So I managed to spend most of my student grant. We used to get paid to go to university. It was rather nice within the first few weeks, but then felt rather guilty and ended up volunteering at a hospice across the road from the hall. It was an unusual experience. I mean, it was quite a sheltered upbringing to some degree. But while I was there was patients mainly with Alzheimer's, and there was one old lady who, when she saw me, I used to push a tea trolley around the room on a Tuesday night. She just recognised me, and she came forward and took my hands and said, you've come back. And I had no idea, obviously, what she was talking about, but I was just, brought up to be polite. So she then said, should we waltz? And we did a waltz. around the room. And every week that same thing happened for about 4 weeks, leading up to Christmas. So after Christmas, I returned from home back to university and went to resume my weekly tea serving duties. As I entered, one of the nurses called me over and she said, I'm so sorry, but the lady with whom you used to dance had passed away over Christmas, but her daughter's given me a letter which she would like you to just explain what happened. And later that evening I opened this letter and it said thank you for dancing with my mother each week, and if I may explain these curious events. During the First World War, my mother was a nurse who was posted down to London, and feeling lonely, she started to attend a weekly tea dance, where she met a charming Indian soldier. Each week they would meet at this tea dance, drink tea, dance a waltz, and talk. And before long, they began to fall in love. But before this love could take any substantive form, the soldier was posted to a front line far away. Their last meeting was incredibly sad, but he promised he absolutely would return. But the truth is, he never did come back from the war, and broken-hearted, my mother met someone else and settled down, had children and grandchildren, and a long and happy life. I just wanted to thank you for showing my mother such kindness in her final days. So for years, I've told the story to family and saying, gosh, it was such a strange thing that happened. But it was my father, a few years ago, when he retired from dentistry, had a diagnosis with Alzheimer's. And I think writing that story down was part of a cathartic exercise, really, being a typical male, sometimes expressing emotionally how you're feeling or finding the words to, describe the tumult within. It can be difficult. What surprised me is I have shared that story now with quite a few people, but is the reaction and the recognition as well, in terms of people and who are going through sadly very similar experiences. So I moved to Wiltshire 31 years ago with work. We spent quite a while trying to figure out where to live, my wife and I, and eventually ended up in a small Wiltshire village. Work was based out of Swindon, and it was lovely. I mean, there was only a few hundred people in this village, and again, probably the only brown face for many miles around until a local Indian restaurant opened up about 10 years later. It was, in terms of the people, were incredibly welcoming and friendly, which was good. Although at one point I was invited into a primary school to talk about India, and they said, dress in your clothes, which I wasn't quite sure what that meant. So I went and found a full Indian outfit, a kurta, and went and spoke about India to the sort of 6-7-year-olds there. And when they started to ask questions then afterwards, I did have to look at the teacher because I couldn't make out a word they said. The accent was so thick, and which has eased over time, but it's I think a different story was, in fact, even a few years later, I met our local politician outside the Indian restaurant which had opened up, and I was stood outside having a sneaky cigarette, and he came out, and he was quite drunk, and he came forward and glared at me, then shook my hand and said, "Thank you for a lovely dinner," which I did tell the restaurant manager, I think you owe me now 3 meals for a month. Because I didn't let him down. I went, "You're most welcome." I shan't name the politician, but he was quite senior. So I'm the eldest son, so again, in traditional Indian families, that comes with a certain degree of expectations. To be honest, my father very generously, when I was 23, sent me to India for all expenses paid holiday. I was wonderful. Went out, and then while we were there, ended up being taken out to meet lots of different families. It took me a while to figure out what was going on, and then I realised these were all potential arranged marriage partners. Although I've got to say, we met 9 families. Probably about half the girls burst into tears at the sight of me, which was not great for my ego. And the other half just decided that I probably wasn't sort of Indian enough, which is an interesting dilemma. In terms of meeting my wife, she's a blonde-haired New Zealander. We met 35 years ago, and happily married since with two amazing kids. Nehru made an interesting point. He said, when you've travelled a lot and you've lived in different cultures, you can both be at home but a stranger in both. Because almost the value system that you've created is one which is an amalgam. Often say when friends are going to India for the first time, I said, there's a point when your plane crosses Pakistan airspace where you're now leaving behind the religions of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, which are religions of black and white, which are then reflected in the values, in terms of how people look at things. The moment that plane crosses, you're now into shades of grey with Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and the way that people look at life and the way people think about time is very different. And you see that in the attitudes and in the values, which is a very long-winded way of saying, I think, in some ways I've ended up finding both. You can be very busy working to a deadline, but equally, if there's a book you want to read, as one aunt once said to me, you can always read it in your next life, but I've decided I'll probably use it this life to have the opportunity to do those things. To be honest, I feel equally comfortable in both. I've actually worked in India, and as a sort of finance director in Mumbai. Initially, after 6 weeks, I rang my dad and thanked him for emigrating. I said, I don't know how you can work in this place. But after a while, actually, once you begin to understand the way of thinking and how it is different, actually then you start to adapt your own style. So in terms of comfort, I can be happily in India, I can be happily here. But here is home. I value the people, the culture, the food, and perversely the weather. I would see myself probably British, yeah. Although when the cricket's on, it becomes a tough one. So both children were born outside the UK. So daughter was born in Hong Kong and son was born in Singapore. We were living in the States actually with two small children when the opportunity to come back to the UK arose. We had my wife and I had a long conversation because I reflected on my upbringing and its sort of experience, and it had been tough. The racism of the 70s and 80s had left an indelible mark, and I wasn't sure. But ultimately, because of family were here, we did come back. But things had changed a lot. In terms of, as I mentioned earlier, the attitudes to different cultures. Access to food, just in terms of what entertainment was available, and so people's mindsets had shifted. And in fact, in many ways, I struggle genuinely to think of a better place actually to raise mixed race children. Father was born in the Punjab, in sort of West India. We describe it, they're a bit like the Geordies of India. They're big, they like their food and their drink and, arguing. Mother actually was from Calcutta, so out in the east. You know what, my parents weren't particularly religious. We would occasionally go for fireworks at Diwali, but no, I think I think it was mainly it was more about social attitudes and political views rather than a religious philosophy. In terms of the ambitions of Indians for their children, it's very much the professions. And I remember one occasion where a bunch of the Punjabis had gathered and had quite a lot of wine, beer and whiskey actually mainly. And they were all sat there and they decided that all the children should come in and say what their career aspirations were. We were all aged under 10 at the time. And in front of me, I remember as I stood there in this queue, and future aspiring doctors, dentists, lawyers, and finally I decided I had to be truthful to what I believed. And as I came forward, aged 8, I admitted I wanted to be a spy like James Bond. I was dragged away in shame. So brought up originally in London and then moved to St Albans, the home counties. Father and my mother and father decided rather than grow up in an Indian enclave, we would move to a a much more sort of representative mix in terms of the sort of typical place to live in the UK. And so, yes, I'm from the age of 5 to 18 in the home counties. So, yeah, lots of Indian food, but no, my father was an absolute lover of Waitrose and their bargain bin at the end of the day. So, no, we tended to eat quite internationally, actually. Lots of different food. We moved to Wiltshire about 30 years ago, working for an office in Swindon, but living in a small Wiltshire village in the centre, not far from Salisbury Plain. It was, 30 years ago. I mean, it was a thatched cottage, so it's a 500-year-old property. I think families struggled a bit. It wasn't proper. They wanted to plaster over the wattle and daub walls and make everything straight. But we loved it, actually. There's that sense of history and culture. Village life is, so when we first moved here, it was mainly people who'd lived here all their lives. There was one occasion when we took a work trip to London and a lot of people were just gazing out the window wide-eyed, never having seen the big city outside of Swindon. But over time it's ended up becoming more and more commuter belt, so the mix has changed. And the accent, actually, the Wiltshire accent has kind of mellowed over time. Or maybe I've just become attuned to understanding what people are saying. For miles around. So my wife and I decided to do, we set up the village wine club, where we would go and buy half a dozen bottles and learn a little bit about them. And after about 15 minutes of people sampling, it really didn't matter what religion or culture you're from. Alcohol was the great leveler. But it was welcoming, actually, and curiosity more than anything, rather than any kind of hostility. That was never encountered that. I think some values transcend a specific race. So if you've got an attitude towards working hard, education, and also community service, those have made a difference. So while in Wiltshire, for example, I think sort of helped establish the financial foundations for the air ambulance, then worked on the local food bank in terms of helping them get established. And in fact, those type of activities have been a way really to work with the community and also give service to the community. They weren't overly happy being the eldest son marrying someone who wasn't from India, but when you have children, actually, that's what changes things. And over time, actually, they also sort of got to know a lady who's been my wife for over 30 years. Interestingly, when we went to India, we had an Indian wedding about 7 years after we were married here. The first thing one aunt said when she saw my wife, she didn't speak much English, she just flung her arms around her and went, "We love you." So there was no colour bar. Actually, just getting to know someone who was kind and genuine and gentle. My wife, she was only we were in our early 20s, certainly helped pull down some of the barriers. Interestingly, it was, I think she's probably had more racism aimed at her than we have as a couple. Ostensibly, we haven't noticed it, and less over the years. That's changed. And as I say, I think just having children and grandchildren, as they say, your grandchildren are your reward for not killing your children. So that worked. The things that I value, the philosophies, and sort of within Hinduism, that tolerance of diversity of opinion. Within a one religion, you've got multiple gods to no gods, and I think that open-mindedness has been certainly something that's sort of embedded itself. I think the other aspects are, and it's probably more to do with the kind of part of India the family are from, but absolute love of food and family is fundamental in terms of where is home is where family is, but also the values around education, but also finding the ways to express yourself, not now necessarily in the way myself and my brothers were brought up in terms of strict professions, but actually being able to demonstrate creativity and that freedom, and recognizing and helping your children understand that life will be constantly full of change, but just go with it and learn to adapt. I think we've given them a lot more freedom. I think there's still expectations that. So I remember with the school reports, one time I had, I think, all A's and one B, and I was absolutely given a hard time over the B. Whereas with the children's reports, there was a grade, but an effort grade, and we said, look, we don't. What are your actual outcome is that's that's a gift from God, but your effort grade, if you don't work hard, then yeah, we don't tolerate that. That's something you're responsible for. But then, my eldest daughter is a painter, and she painted her brother in a beautiful purple dress, and I'm just kind of grateful that my father didn't see that. I think he would struggle.